After I refused to give my mom my inheritance, she invited me to a family meeting. When I arrived, there were lawyers waiting to force me to sign it over. But the moment they handed me the papers, I just smiled and said, "Funny. I brought someone too." Hi, I'm Danielle, 29F, and this is the story of how my own mother tried to ambush me with lawyers to steal my inheritance, only for things to go completely sideways for her. I'm still shaking from how it all played out, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I've taken my power back. To begin with, let me explain that I come from a very complicated family. I grew up with my mom, her second husband Greg, and my younger half-brother Tyler. My biological dad passed away when I was 10, and it devastated me. He was my anchor, my protector, the only one who truly made me feel seen. After he died, everything changed. My mom remarried within a year. Greg was never cruel, but I wouldn't call him kind either. He tolerated me, and that was about it. He always favored Tyler, his biological son, and so did my mom. Over time, it became clear that I was just extra, an obligation they had to deal with. As a teenager, I became invisible unless they needed something from me. Fast forward to college. I worked 2 jobs, studied full-time, and still sent money home when Tyler was going through a rebellious phase. Mom would call me crying, saying they couldn't control him, they needed help, and of course, I caved every time. I thought if I kept being the good daughter, maybe one day they'd appreciate me. That day never came. When my grandfather passed away last year, everything shifted again. He was my dad's father and had always stayed in touch with me, even after Dad died. I didn't realize until the reading of the will just how much he had left behind, and how much of it was meant specifically for me. He left me everything. Not just the house, but his stocks, bonds, savings, nearly $900,000 in total. I cried when the lawyer read it. My grandfather had written a letter for me too, saying he knew my mom and Greg would never give me what I deserved, and he wanted to give me a safety net to build the life I'd always dreamed of. When I told my mom about the inheritance, her entire tone changed. Suddenly, she was sweet, overly affectionate, asking me if I needed help managing such a large amount of money. I was polite but firm. This was mine, and I was going to handle it myself. That was when the manipulation started. At first, it was guilt trips. How could I hoard money when my family was struggling? Didn't I care about Tyler, who was trying to start a new business? Didn't I want to help Greg, who had back problems and couldn't work anymore? Then came the outright pressure. She called me one night and said, very calmly, that it would be best if I transferred the money into a family trust she would manage. I laughed. I genuinely thought she was joking. She wasn't. When I refused, things escalated. I started getting messages from Greg, passive-aggressive texts from Tyler, and even calls from extended relatives I barely knew, all asking me why I was being selfish. I went no contact for a few weeks. I needed space. I spoke with my lawyer and financial advisor and started locking everything down. I moved my funds to a secure bank, changed all my passwords, and made sure the deed to my grandfather's house was legally in my name. Then last weekend, I got a group text from my mom saying we needed to have a family meeting. She said it was time we all sat down and worked things out like adults. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I figured if they wanted to argue, fine. I'd show up, say my piece, and leave. But what I walked into was something else entirely. The meeting was at Greg's office, which should have been my first red flag. I walked in wearing a simple blouse and jeans, calm and composed, only to find a long conference table with not just my mom, Greg, and Tyler, but 2 lawyers sitting across from them. I froze. My mom stood up and smiled in that sickly sweet way she always did when she was up to something. "Danielle, sweetheart, we're just here to talk. These attorneys are here to help guide the process." I narrowed my eyes. What process? That was when they slid a folder across the table to me. It was a drafted legal agreement stating that I would sign over 80% of my inheritance to a newly established family trust, controlled by my mother and Greg, of course, with an allowance doled out to me monthly. The justification? To ensure fair distribution and prevent reckless spending. I didn't say a word. I didn't even open the folder. I just looked around at the smug faces sitting across from me. Tyler leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, like he'd already won. I took a slow breath. Then I smiled. "Funny," I said, "because I brought someone too." At that exact moment, the door opened behind me and in walked Marcia, my attorney. She was calm, elegant, and holding a thick binder in one hand. The expressions on their faces flipped like a switch. I introduced her, and then calmly sat down. Marcia walked over to the head of the table and said, "Before any discussion proceeds, my client has asked me to review the documents being presented and assess whether any undue coercion is taking place. Because from what I can see, this entire gathering seems highly questionable, both legally and ethically." My mom's face turned bright red. Greg started to sputter. Tyler looked like someone had just punched him in the gut. But Marcia wasn't done. She pulled out copies of the will, proof of fund transfers, and documentation that all my grandfather's assets had been legally inherited by me, with no clauses or contingencies. She calmly laid it all out and said, "This inheritance is the sole property of my client. Any attempt to transfer it under pressure or manipulation could be seen as financial abuse and fraud. And rest assured, we will press charges if necessary." The room went dead silent. My mom tried to protest, saying I didn't understand what I was doing, that they were just trying to help me manage things responsibly. But the act was over. I stood up, looked her in the eye, and said, "You've treated me like an outsider my whole life. You never protected me, never supported me, and now you want to steal from me too? That money isn't yours. It never was." I walked out without looking back. But I wish I could say that was the end of it, that they accepted defeat and left me alone. It wasn't. The next day, I got a notification that someone had tried to access my online banking account. Then came the threatening messages from Tyler, saying I'd better come to my senses or else. They're not letting this go quietly. And I'm starting to realize that they never will. But what they don't know is I'm not backing down. It had only been 48 hours since I walked out of that so-called family meeting, but the fallout was immediate and aggressive. By the next morning, my phone was blowing up. Voicemails from unknown numbers. Emails disguised as legal notices. Texts from Tyler that quickly devolved from guilt trips to open threats. He actually texted me, "You think you're untouchable now? That money belongs to the family. Grandpa was senile. Everyone knows it. If you don't fix this, you'll regret it." I didn't respond. I just forwarded it to Marcia. At that point, my emotions were shifting from shock to rage. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself to accommodate their dysfunction, staying quiet to keep the peace, saying yes when I wanted to scream no, pouring myself dry for family that only saw me as useful when I had something they could take. But now I had something they couldn't take, and it was driving them insane. Marcia acted swiftly. We filed a cease and desist against all three of them. Any further harassment would be met with restraining orders and criminal charges. I also had my banking institution launch a fraud investigation into the attempted login, which came from Greg's office IP address. They were sloppy, desperate, and stupid. I thought that would be enough. It wasn't. About a week later, I was coming back from the grocery store when I noticed a car parked across from my house. It was Greg's truck, just sitting there. No one got out. No one rang the bell. But it was a message. A warning. I called the police. Filed a report. Again, forwarded everything to Marcia. She advised me to consider getting a security system. I did one better. I installed cameras, changed all my locks, and bought a guard dog. His name is Diesel, and he's the sweetest thing on earth until he senses a threat. Then he becomes a different animal. A few days later, I got a knock on the door. I checked the camera. It was my mother, alone. I almost didn't open it, but something in me wanted closure. Wanted to look her in the eye one last time. She looked older. Tired. But not sorry. Never sorry. "Danielle," she said, "I know things got out of hand. We were just scared. Tyler's business is in trouble. Greg hasn't worked in months. We thought maybe if we could just talk, you'd see we're not the enemy." The enemy. That word stuck with me. I didn't say anything. I just let her talk. She kept going about how hard things had been, how I didn't understand what it meant to be part of a real family, how Grandpa had made a mistake leaving it all to me. And then came the kicker. "You don't deserve all of it, Danielle. You're just one person. Tyler's got a family to think about. Greg and I are drowning in debt. We thought you loved us enough to share." I took a deep breath. And I said something I had never said to her before. "No." Not in an angry scream. Not in a teary breakdown. Just a firm, unshakable no.
No, Mom.
You don't get to guilt me anymore. You don't get to play victim when all you've done is manipulate, steal, and lie. You abandoned me emotionally years ago. Grandpa saw it. That's why he left it to me. And whether you like it or not, I'm done being your scapegoat. She stared at me like she didn't recognize me. Maybe she didn't. The old Danielle would have cried, would have begged for peace. But that girl was gone. I shut the door. The next day, I got a letter from a different law firm. They were trying to sue me, claiming Grandpa had been mentally incompetent when he wrote the will. I laughed out loud. He'd updated his will twice in the last 2 years, both times with full medical clearance and witnesses. Marcia sent back a 20-page rebuttal so fast it made their head spin. We counter-threatened with a lawsuit for emotional distress, attempted fraud, and defamation. That's when it stopped.
Completely.
No more texts. No more surprise visits. No more creepy cars parked across the street. It was like they had finally realized the truth. They had lost. But the damage had already been done. I started therapy. 4 years of gaslighting, emotional abuse, and misplaced loyalty. I finally let myself grieve, not just my grandfather, but the childhood I never really had. I cried for the little girl who kept trying to earn love that was never freely given. I grieved the idea of family I had clung to for too long. Then, I started to rebuild. I renovated Grandpa's house and moved in full-time. I planted a garden, hosted dinners with friends who felt more like family than my blood ever did. I donated a portion of the inheritance to organizations that support kids who age out of toxic homes. I started my own business, something I'd dreamed of for years but never believed I could do until now. And as for my mother, Greg, and Tyler, I heard through a cousin that Greg had to sell his truck. Tyler's business failed. My mom is renting out rooms in their house to make ends meet. They're still spinning the story to anyone who'll listen that I stole what was rightfully theirs. That I'm greedy and heartless. But I've made peace with it. Because the truth is, I didn't just inherit money. I inherited freedom. The freedom to choose my peace over their chaos. The freedom to say no. To walk away. To never go back. And that, more than anything else, is what they'll never forgive me for.